series, which I kind of want to remember you all that it's going to be the third Thursday of the month, starting today with our speaker, Dr. Hartl. Just a little bit of housekeeping information. Please keep your microphone muted throughout the webinar. You can raise your hand at the end for the Q&A session, and we'll make sure that your question get answered. And we are also live streaming this webinar on YouTube. So if you don't want to be seen on YouTube per se, please keep your camera off and that won't be any problem. Now, as I said, the webinars are every third Thursday of each month, 10 a.m. New York City time. And without any further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Roger Härtl, the founder of the Tanzania Neurosurgery Project, the man behind the idea of this whole thing in collaboration with the surgeons in Tanzania. And I will let him share his presentation and share with us all of his experience throughout the life of the Tanzania Neurosurgery Project. So thank you and welcome for being here.
Well, thank you, Magali. Thank you for this really kind introduction. Can you see my slides?
Not yet.
I shared it. I'll stop sharing. I share. Let me share again. Right.
Someone said they can see it, so that's good.
Well, all right, let's see if you can do this here. You see this one? You see it?
Yes, that's great.
All right, it's great. All right, good. Well, Magali, thank you for this very kind introduction. Now, I just want to mention, I'm not the founder of anything really. You know, what we started really is the collaboration between Weill Cornell, and initially, you know, we had that Cornell still has a very, very strong relationship with Bugando, which is in Mwanza, as you know. And then what we did in neurosurgery, you know, we started collaborating with colleagues at Bugando, and then over the years, it just became clear that given the requirements of a successful neurosurgical program, that made more sense to really work with MOI because of the program that was there already and the infrastructure. But we still obviously are very, very close with Bugando as well. And that's really how this project started about 15 years ago and initiated through a patient contact that I had, and then just the clear need. But there are many, many others, as you all know, neurosurgeons who've had very, very close ties and huge impact in East Africa, Tanzania, and we'll talk about some of those programs as well. So thanks for having me, and Magali, thank you for Magali and Romani really for pushing this initiative, this roundtable. I think that's a great idea, and I hope we'll have a lot of interesting speakers present over the years. So my goal is really to kind of talk a little bit about this particular collaboration that we have now with MOI primarily, not that much with Bugando. Obviously, all of you are familiar with Tanzania, beautiful country in East Africa, about 50, 60 million people. When I first, you know, I was there I was in Malawi actually as a medical student, and I always wanted to go back and have some kind of impact as a neurosurgeon, and that was difficult to do. And it was only later on when I had a patient from Tanzania who I was taking care of, who invited me to come to Tanzania, where I actually went to a hospital, and it was clear then that, and I went to MOI actually, and Dr. Kinasha was there, and I think I saw his name here. He may have dialed in, and it was about 15 years ago. And you know, country of, you know, 50, 60 million people at the time, there were only three neurosurgeons for the whole country, and they were all in this particular hospital at MOI. So it became instantly clear that there was an opportunity here, obviously a huge problem, but also an opportunity maybe through collaboration with a large academic center in North America to maybe help them train and teach neurosurgeons. But again, you know, I'm not the only one who's done that. You know, Fiends, you know, Robert Dempsey, Paul Young, many others have very, very close relationships and have done amazing work. So I happened to walk into this hospital in 2008, and Dr. Kinasha, who you can see here, he looks exactly the same. if you look at me there, I don't look that pretty anymore. But and then of course what we did back then was, the obvious thing was to bring equipment, which is something that we still do, but I think now in a much more defined and careful manner. So back then, you can see here the picture below. Synthes back then was very, very generous, and companies, I have to say, in general, are very, very generous when it comes to these types of projects. They gave us implants, instrumentation. Some of that is still being used now at Moy. And DePuy Synthes and many other companies have really supported us throughout this journey. So that was 2008. And the other thing that has happened really since then is the realization that surgery matters. Back then, I mentioned I was a medical student, I was in Malawi. And then when I went through neurosurgical training, I was always trying to figure out a way. And I know that many others here have the same struggle. You try to figure out, well, how can I help? How can I get to those places? How can I find out what's needed? Is there any need for a particular subspecialty such as myself? So I contacted, at the time, I got in touch with Doctors Without Borders. I got in touch with the Gates Foundation. And you can see that a lot of these big foundations, they do amazing work, but they don't really focus on neurosurgical problems because the volume in their mind is not there. Now, that's obviously a matter of interpretation, but it is true that a lot of these big organizations don't really focus on surgery, certainly not on neurosurgery. So anyway, so because of our relationship, the relationship that Cornell has with Bugando, we started going to Bugando. And of course, again, what we did initially was we would come every year, would bring a lot of doctors, nurses, anesthesiologists, and then we would gather equipment in New York, books, ventilators, operating room tables, and ship them to Bugando or Moy. But we quickly realized that was not really a viable, a sustainable path going forward, simply because if you bring equipment in, you somewhat are responsible for it, or the people there will be responsible for it, and it's a huge responsibility and burden. Plus, we can't really assess really what their needs are, and a lot of Tanzanians here on the call, you guys know better what you need. If we just bring in equipment, we brought in things that we thought were important, but nobody really cared. So we stopped doing that, and then we really started focusing on things that matter. And what we came up with over the last 15 years is what I call a 7-point sustainable initiative. And what that entails, and this is really has evolved through trial and error, mostly, is the obviously you got to go there physically. And I personally, I go once a year to Tanzania for a week or for 10 days. So how do you make that work, though? How can you go only once a year and still have an impact? Well, we started then doing courses. So a symposium initially, and Roseanne is on the call here. I remember initially Roseanne, the team here in New York, was heavily involved in putting the schedule together. Now, and that's really, in my mind, one of the huge successes of this program is now with the team at Moy, Dr. Shabani, Dr. Lemeri, many others in Tanzania. They basically organize the course, and we just show up and we support it if possible, if necessary. But that already, I think, the fact that we can help young surgeons over there to create a symposium, a course, put their name out there, attract people from all over the world. That in itself, I think, is already a huge success of the program. And then, of course, short-term fellowships. So we have physicians, and I'll show you a list and some pictures. We've got neurosurgeons, anesthesiologists, ICU doctors, radiologists, nurses who have come to New York for short-term fellowships. And this is all organized through our Global Health Initiative here, and it's all funded through patient donations. So everything that I talk about is really funded through patient donations, which practicing on the Upper East Side in New York is one of the benefits, that we have access to a lot of wealthy and very, very open-minded patients who are always excited to support this. Now, and then what really made a huge difference was once we had enough funding to actually hire fully trained neurosurgeons to go the other way around, to go from North America or from Europe to Tanzania and spend a whole year there. And Magali had the benefit of being one of those surgeons. And I think it's a great experience for the individual. And I can give you some examples. We've had doctors from, a doctor from Belgium, Francois, who went to Tanzania with his wife and 2 children. They went to school there for a year. It's really a landmark experience for the individual surgeon and their families, but it's also great for the Tanzanians, I think, to have that exchange. And certainly for the program, that's really the core of the program, because those fellows there, when they're there, they make sure that our program really works properly. We decided, instead of bringing a lot of equipment, that we would help the Tanzanians with research. And what that means is basically a registry, and I'll talk about that later on. Weekly Zoom conferences, which is really the most painful part, but because it's very early in the morning, and then with the internet challenges, that's been a challenge, but it works out really nicely now. And then, of course, publications. I'm a big believer in supporting the young, talented, and motivated colleagues in Tanzania to make sure that they write papers, they put their names out there, they publish. I think that's really a direct and an indirect way of promoting their personal careers, but also promoting healthcare in that country. So those are the 7 steps. We've got a nice website if you want to check that out. Some examples of those short-term visitors from Tanzania. Of course, Dr. Shabani Othman came, Jaffet, who's currently doing now training in South Africa, I believe, and many others here. Constancia was recently there, who is helping us out. Juma Magogo, who is now doing the scoliosis work in Tanzania with several other surgeons. And then some of our long-term fellows, Francois Water came from Belgium, who I mentioned, who was in Tanzania for a year. Beverly, who trained in the UK, she's now in Kenya. She spent a year in Tanzania during COVID. That was a special experience, and she did an amazing job. Anthony, who is sitting right next to me, he's actually from Nigeria, was a research fellow in Tanzania, now a research fellow here. And then several others. One of our first fellows was Maria Santos here, who's a pediatric neurosurgeon from Lisbon, who's done tremendous work in Tanzania and now in Lisbon. Andreas Leidinger from Barcelona, and then Scott Zuckerman, who's at Vanderbilt now. He's a US-trained neurosurgeon. Julie Woodfield, of course. Romani is our research fellow currently in Tanzania. And then Magali, everybody knows, and Albert. Now, a core portion of our program is this. Initially, we called it a neurotrauma course. Now it's more like a global neurosurgery course. You can see here we've done, I don't know how many, but many courses every year, supported by the AO, Brain Trauma Foundation, FIENS, of course, heavily supported by the Tanzanians, of course, and then also by many others. I gotta also put a shout out to my chairman, Phil Steek, here, who has been very, very supportive. Nothing happens if your chairman doesn't allow you to do stuff. So he's been part of this, and he's been extremely supportive and instrumental in really making this a success. Now, in terms of then, I gave you a little bit of a background, what we decided to do and what we decided not to do. So we decided not to really support with a lot of equipment. The other thing that we decided not to do was, some other programs bring whole teams over. They come with anesthesiologists, nurses. We did that a little bit for a while, but then we realized that probably doesn't have really a big impact. It's a great experience for the individuals, but it doesn't really leave a lot of footprint on the ground. So then what we decided to do is really to focus on education and data collection. And we started data collection with head injury. My initial interest was head trauma, and still is, of course. So we published a lot about head trauma, and we did that together with Halinder Mangat, who is also part of this project, who is a neurointensivist who's still involved very heavily. And then, because of my clinical background and my expertise really in spine surgery here in New York, then the obvious decision was, well, let's look at spine trauma, because that's something that I do clinically all the time and that I had a closer relationship with. So it was kind of a more obvious thing to do. Plus, there was a huge need. There was a lot of work being done overall with severe traumatic brain injury, but spine trauma, a huge problem. If you ever go over to East Africa, Tanzania, or any of the LMICs, you'll see, neurotrauma, obviously the most important cause of death and disability in young people. but especially spine trauma, incredibly devastating and resource intensive, because you need, for example, for proper treatment, you need implants, and that's a huge challenge, as we'll find out. So we decided, I think it was 2015 or so, to implement a registry, not a trial, not a study, just a registry where we would consecutively collect data on all spine trauma patients that would come to MOI. And I think that also coincided with one of our first fellows at MOI, and that was Andreas Leidinger, who's now a neurosurgeon in Barcelona. And him, together with the team locally, with Ruta, Dr. Shabani, and many others, really implemented this registry, and that's all IRB approved, and it's all being done properly, of course. Now, we collected data, and I think this was one of the first publications then in 2019, and this summarized data on 180 patients, all with spine trauma. And the interesting observation, and these are all observations, of course, was that a lot of these patients ended up needing surgery. Frequently, the surgery could not be done because there was no insurance, the implants were not available. But delayed or prolonged time to the operating room was usually, like I said, lack of instrumentation, insurance. But surgery and earlier surgery actually were associated with improved outcome, which was very, and this is obvious, but in the North American or European literature, it's very, very difficult to show that. But I think that was one of the opportunities that we had in Tanzania because of the delays to really see a relationship between earlier time to the operating room and improved outcomes. And these were some of the cases that were done as part of this ongoing survey. Again, it's not a study, it's really more a registry. And the implants were usually donated by companies. When there were visiting surgeons coming in, they would bring implants from their local vendors. They also purchase implants locally, of course, but a lot of these were really done by donations from North America and Europe. Now, this is one of the slides from this study, and just looking at the times involved, right? So we had about 180 patients that were studied here. So the total time from trauma for them to arrive at MOI, which is in Dar es Salaam here, was about 6 days to get there. And the total hospital stay was about 33 days. And then if you look at patients who came from less than 100 kilometers, which were about half the patients, it took them almost 3 days to get to the hospital, then 33 days if they needed surgery for them to have surgery, and then they would stay another 11 days. And then there were a lot of patients, half the patients came from more than 100 kilometers away, and obviously it takes longer. And then the same thing, though, the delay for surgery, 30 days. So tremendous delays in surgery. I have a bunch of pictures in here. This is actually from Bugando. This was, at the beginning of the program in Bugando. This is one of our neurosurgery residents who's practicing now in Alabama, at least last time I heard, and a great guy, David Rubin. And then there's a nice picture. You can see everybody kind of watching. And again, always operating together. What we found was when we brought in anesthesiology and nurses, that what ended up happening was that all the visitors from New York, they would all operate together, and there was no real communication. So we stopped doing that. So now we actually, I rarely scrub. I mean, the whole point is not scrubbing. The point is really education and teaching and training. So, and then we had Andre Leon there. Andre Leon is a journalist, actually a very well-known award photographer who came one year, and he took beautiful pictures in the operating room in Bugando. So what else came out of this study? So that we saw certain relationships. For example, and this is again the first study that Andreas Leidinger published. So the time to the operating room was really dependent on the insurance. If somebody had private insurance, they went to the operating room earlier. I mean, it's obvious, but it's terrible, right? And then there was a relationship between improvement in neurological outcomes and a faster time to the operating room. And yeah, those patients who had surgery in general did better than those who didn't have surgery. So a lot of observations that were quite interesting. Now, a follow-up study then a few years later was when we looked at the subset of patients who just had surgery. And this was done, and then that was the time then when Scott Zuckerman was there. Scott Zuckerman joined the program for about 6 months with his wife. It was incredibly productive. And then obviously Andreas Leidinger was also involved, and then Dr. Shabani, Ruta, Albert Lazaro, Dr. Mango, Yuma Magogo, and many others. So again, similar theme though. So in this study, we looked at almost 100 patients who underwent surgery. The only predictor of neurological improvement in these patients was earlier time to the operating room. Again, something you can't really show in North American literature because everybody's taken to the operating room anyway, very, very quickly. So then to show a difference between 6 hours and 12 hours and 1 day, very, very difficult. In Tanzania, that was easier to do because of these long delays. And each day taken to the operating room earlier resulted in a 4% increased odds ratio of neurological improvement. And again, what were the delays? The delays are the costs involved with implants because patients have to pay for the implants beforehand. And then, or there were no implants available and lack of comfort level training. Now then, a follow-up study that was really spearheaded then by Scott Zuckerman was cost effectiveness. So we tried to look at cost effectiveness, which is obviously very, very difficult. And this was more like a preliminary study. But the interesting thing here was if you compare surgery for spine trauma to other things that are commonly done in LMICs and are deemed to be very, very effective, such as cesarean section, hydrocephalus treatment, that the cost effectiveness of spinal surgery was actually right in that range, was just as effective as cesarean section or hydrocephalus treatment. And this is very important to realize that it is very expensive. Implants are very, very expensive. But it is cost effective if you really do it right, and it is important. It has a huge impact. So I think that was very effective in our attempt to maybe push the hospital, maybe push the healthcare system there to really accept implants for trauma, not only for spine trauma, as really part of something that the hospital and the healthcare system should really apply or supply free of charges to the patient. Also, so it can be done quickly, so you don't have to wait 3 weeks before they can come up with the money for the implants. Now then, Scott also then, while he was there, he worked very closely with the Tanzanian surgeons, and they decided to implement a protocol. We obviously knew that the delays to the operating room, which were like 30 days, so it made sense to kind of adopt the model that we follow in the rest of the world, is where we generally accept that that's faster, time is spine. So faster time to the operating room is important because it improves outcomes. So the decision was made to implement a protocol for a while, trying to get these patients to the operating room within 3 days. And the grant was really the implants. So the Pew Synthes gave the implants for this study that was done, and I'll show you some of the results. So Scott was there for 6 months, and during that time period, they really tried to take these patients to the operating room as quickly as possible. And you can see here that they were actually very successful in doing that. So days from admission to surgery dropped from 24 days before this protocol to 2.1 days. And for incomplete spinal cord injuries, which are the ones that you really want to take to the operating room quickly, 22 days dropped to 1.8 days. So that's amazing. So what else happened? Now, if you look at mortality, though, we had there were some very concerning observations. And the observation was overall that the surgical mortality overall increased from 5 to 27%. And why was that? It was really because of cervical cases. The mortality increased because of a lot of cervical patients who had severe cervical spinal cord injuries were taken to the operating room and then unfortunately passed away soon after or in a delayed fashion, usually in the ICU. So that was obviously an alarming observation, and we looked into this very, very carefully. And I remember Beverly was very much involved in that, and Scott, of course, were very worried about this. These are some of the pictures of cases that were done. But basically what the conclusion was that it was, the patient selection was off. A lot of these patients were not hemodynamically stable when they were taken to the operating room. And then there were a few things that happened at the time. And these things, you got to take those things into consideration if you do this type of work. And that's one of the lessons that we learned. A new ICU was implemented, a step-down unit was implemented, plus this new protocol. And there were shortages in terms of training, staffing, equipment. There were a lot of shortages that really led to these patients not being probably taken care of properly, but also patient selection really was a problem. I think that some of these patients who were taken to the OR just should have been stabilized further before even considering an operation. The protocol also stipulated, which is something that we didn't really follow, that these were incomplete spinal cord injury patients that were taken to the OR. And in these cervical cases, several of those had complete spinal cord injuries, which probably should not have been taken at that time. So anyway, those lessons were learned, and we overcame those. And then when Scott left, then I think that protocol kind of was slowly abandoned, and things went back to the routine. The other thing that we did over these years now since then, and that was really spearheaded by Anthony, who's now a research fellow here, was really trying to look at long-term outcomes. Now, we looked at 2-week outcomes or outcome at discharge, and then the realization really came up, of course, that you got to look at long-term outcomes, which is something that we're trying to do now. Also, the translation of some of these outcome forms from English into the local language, which Anthony really spearheaded with the AO, which is a nice little project. And then currently, one of our most recent publications when it comes to spine trauma is this one here. So looking at mechanism of injury and to see if it's associated with outcome in spinal trauma, which we found that it was not. About half those patients have spinal cord injury or spine trauma from motor vehicle accidents, and there was no real relationship with outcome based on the mechanism. So that means obviously that you have to allocate resources equitable. It doesn't make sense to just focus on motor vehicle accidents because the others are just as bad. And targeted prevention and comprehensive trauma care system. Another publication that came out recently was really, again, a summary of the overall results of thoracolumbar and lumbar spine trauma. And that was just published, 257 patients. Surgery rate was about 65%. Median time to surgery, you see here, 17 days. So it was 28 days initially. And then it dropped to like 2 days when Scott was there. And we really had this focused effort on the protocol. And now it kind of went back to 17 days, which is a problem. And why did it go back? Well, it went back because remember when Scott Zuckerman was there, we had implants that we would use for free that were donated by a company. So we had immediate access to implants. Now that we don't have those implants, we went back, or they went back to the system where patients have to pay for this. So that's a huge problem. My hope would be that somebody actually looks at the papers that we publish and realizes that it is cost effective and it is important to have a healthcare system that provides implants, at least for emergency cases, at no cost to the patient. Now, this is a case, and this is just a case from that study, just an example, the types of fixation that were done. Now, I'm very excited also to share with you now that we started working with UCSF and with SIGN. SIGN is a nonprofit organization that is very well known to the orthopedic spine orthopedic trauma surgeons really around the world, because they have a system in place where they provide certain types of implants for long bone fractures for free, and are being utilized in many countries around the world that can't afford implants. And SIGN approached us with the idea of also providing spine implants for free. And UCSF was very involved in that. So now we started this collaboration between MOI, UCSF, Cornell, and SIGN. And we just actually started our database, which is essentially a similar database to the one that we had before. But now the goal is to actually be able to provide implants for free. So hopefully we'll go back to those days where we had earlier time to the OR without a higher mortality, of course. And that's really the goal. We just started that. And SIGN has not made their own implants yet. So we're still, but they have donations through companies. Right now, I think it's Medtronic DePuy also gave us more implants. So I think we should be fine for the next year or so, providing implants for free. But eventually, of course, there has to be some kind of sustainability model in place. And I know that with the Barrows and we had a conversation with Dilan Iligal and others. There are efforts underway, and maybe some of you here on the call know more about this, to actually have local manufacturers in Tanzania make their own implants. And I think that's very, very exciting, you know. A few other things I want to talk about towards the end of my presentation is what else have we done in terms of education and training as part of our program. Now, COVID in this regard was somewhat helpful, believe it or not, because it really forced all of us to discover new ways of teaching and training, basically remote teaching and training. So we did a study with these goggles where we had surgeons in Tanzania wear the goggles, and then we were monitoring that from New York and we're interacting. The problem there was that the internet signal was not strong enough in the OR in Tanzania, so we never really got this to work, but it's certainly a good idea. The other thing that started during COVID was really that we had two deformity surgeons, Massimo Balsano from Verona in Italy, and Ala Ahmed from Palestine, who had a real interest in teaching and training scoliosis deformity surgery in Tanzania. No, I got to tell you, I thought that this was really never going to fly. I thought the last thing that the Tanzanians need is scoliosis surgery. I always thought it's head trauma, head injury, spine trauma. But this actually evolved into one of the really successful sub-programs that we supported because the hospital then, first of all, the way they did it was great because they really took their time to have sessions like Zoom sessions on weekends before even going to Tanzania. So they had a pre-course evaluation, orientation, this took months before they actually went there. Identify patients, people had to sign up, people had to sign in on a regular basis, local surgeons, and then they identified patients, and then they went to Tanzania for a week to do these operations, supported by a company. It was Globus, I think, once it was Nuvasive, and had great outcomes. Patients did really, really well. The hospital was happy, and the patients were happy. And the reason the hospital was happy, and this is an important lesson to be learned, was that a lot of these patients were patients who had chronic problems, younger patients, who frequently would have been shipped to India or elsewhere for very, very expensive surgery. Now, suddenly, the Tanzanians, with the help of Massimo and Ala, could actually take care of these patients locally, made a huge impact. And that's the first time I got a thank you letter from the hospital, even though I wasn't really directly involved in these surgeries. But it was really a lesson learned. So you got to take these things into consideration if you're interested in global work, not only what you're interested in, but try to think about what the impact that you can have on the healthcare system. So scoliosis surgery is huge because these patients need very, very expensive surgery. And these are patients who are, people are aware of those patients, and they're not going to be neglected necessarily. A lot of these patients are really being shipped elsewhere for expensive surgery. So if you can train the local surgeons to take care of this, with spine trauma, it's not really that obvious. Spine trauma happens, and whether these patients are being taken, I'm very blunt now, but whether these patients are really being taken care of or not is not doesn't seem to be the immediate concern of the individuals really in charge, unfortunately. Now, this is a little bit of an inflammatory remark and challenging, but I really want to challenge them because they just don't care as much about spine trauma, unfortunately, or head injury. But scoliosis surgery seems to be different, and we continue to do this. We have a scoliosis course coming up. So kudos to Massimo Balsamo, Ala Ahmed, and the Dr. Magogo, and the other surgeons at Moy who really spearheaded this. Another thing I want to talk about is leapfrogging. So I talked initially about equipment and how we decided not to bring equipment over there. However, that notion kind of changed over the years because there were certain things that we realized were potentially helpful. Like, for example, navigation. We brought, and this was heavily supported by Brain Lab and their philanthropic arm. And so in 2017 or 18, we brought a 2D navigation system to Tanzania and did surgeries there together with the surgeons. And that was only for a week. And then next year for another week. And that was very successful. And then BrainLab actually donated a 3D navigation system 2 years ago. And that, I think, has also been really a success story. The other thing that we used was virtual reality for teaching and training, of course. And, there are certain things I think that you can really implement as long as you make sure that there are people who are responsible, there's a real interest there, and there's a support structure in place. Like BrainLab, for example, committed to supporting the Tanzanians and have also done this for the most part very successfully. So you got to make sure that if you bring in equipment, that this equipment is really being supported. This was one of the first navigated cases that we did in Tanzania. There's a interbody fusion case a few years ago. And then the beauty is with having Romani there and Magali and other fellows that we actually following the learning curve, right? Like every BrainLab case in Tanzania now, we're monitoring these cases. We're looking at the case, the quality, the length of time, and we're monitoring this over time to kind of describe the learning curve. And does this really make sense? The other thing that we brought over, I do a lot of minimally invasive surgery. I was obviously interested in tubular surgery. So we brought a tubular system over. At Moy, they only have one microscope, and the microscope is used for cranial surgery, obviously. So we didn't have really a microscope for spine surgery. Now, I use the microscope all the time, but there is a system in place now called the Vision. It's a tubular retractor that has its light source, and you can project it on a big screen. It's a 2D system. So the company was very generous, gave us a bunch of these systems, and we started doing tubular cases then off the screen, 2D, a number of years ago. And Dr. Shabani and his team and Dr. Beretta and others really have done a great job implementing these cases. The one thing I didn't realize with tubular surgery was that we use so much flow seal and hemostatic agents for the epidural bleeding, and we take it for granted here. In Tanzania, you don't have that, so you got to be very, very careful. So epidural bleeding can be a little bit of a challenge, but they seem to have mastered this now. And we did a bunch of cases, and they're just they're writing up the results. And then the thing that we did in March of this year, which was really the next step then, was endoscopy, right? Especially if you think about the epidural bleeding, I thought, well, if epidural bleeding with tubular MIS surgery is a problem, then endoscopy may be really a solution to that, because first of all, they do a lot of cranial endoscopy. So, Dr. Shabani and the surgeons there they do more cranial endoscopy than anybody in the world, probably. So they're really, really good at 2D surgery. And so spinal endoscopy should be a no-brainer in Tanzania. So Lynn McGrath, who at the time was part of our faculty, is a great guy, great surgeon, who is now in Maine. He had Joymax bring over a system for 1 week to do spinal endoscopy. First in a model, we did it here on the left side in a real spine model, and then they did a few cases, and I think it was very, very successful. You see here Dr. Kinasha trying to pick up, Dr. Kinasha, who really started the program 15 years ago, more interested in endoscopy than most of the other colleagues. It's just kudos, I really admire him. And I don't do endoscopy. It's too complicated, okay? But Dr. Kinasha really had the fortitude and the strength. So good for you. So anyway, so now we're pursuing that, and we want to do an endoscopy course, just like we do a scoliosis course. We're working on that with colleagues from UCI on the West Coast and other surgeons, Lynn McGrath, Osama Kaslan, and others. So, I was trying to give you an overview over our program there. Again, it's a very, very focused program. We work essentially with one hospital, a little bit with Bugando. It evolved over many years, trial and error. The key is collaboration, not isolation. I'm only as successful and good as the people that I work with, and that's really, and especially in Tanzania, you got to have people on the ground who you can trust, who want to do this, who are really enthusiastic. And I think we have that right now. We've got a great leadership with Dr. Lemary, Dr. Shabani, Dr. Ruta Othman, and many others over there who are incredibly supportive. The key again is you've got to show up at least once a year, in my opinion. The course is a key, and have the local surgeons there really get involved in terms of the program and faculty selection. The fellowships going back and forth are very, very important. And then collect data and publish. I think that's important. That gives the local surgeons the opportunity to become famous and to write things, teaches them about research, ethical research. And then obviously weekly Zoom conferences, and now with WhatsApp, we're in contact daily, of course. That's very important. So I look at this as a model really for other institutions to, if you are somewhere in North America, in South America, in Asia, wherever you are, and you want to do something like that with a different hospital, I think this is a nice template to at least consider, and reach out to your patients. Patients are incredibly generous, and and you can really collect funds to support this. And then companies are also very, very generous, but you got to be obviously very careful. So thanks to everybody involved. We've got Julie here, Magali, Romani in this picture, Anthony, our research fellow. So without those guys, really nothing would happen. And then Global Spine Congress last year, this year I didn't make it, but Romani was there, and Anthony, we support them when they present papers. That's really something that we're very, very proud of, and Magali, and that's the website. And if you have an interest in minimally invasive spinal surgery, come to New York in December. We've got a big MIS course, and you can learn everything about endoscopy, virtual reality, augmented reality, tubular surgery from the masters. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Härtl. Thank you for your great presentation. We have a couple of minutes for question. If you guys have any question at all, you can raise your hand or you can write it in the chat. And if your question is not answered, we'll make sure we can reach out to you or something. That was very insightful. A lot of things has been happening, and I'm excited for the next webinar that will be occurring next month as well. This is just a reminder of what's coming next. We have Kiran Thakur who raised their hand for a question. You can unmute and ask your question.
Great. Thank you so much. This was really incredible. I'm a neurologist at Columbia and work in global health and neuroinfectious diseases. So just listening about kind of the layers of how you built this program and what has been accomplished over decades is really, really inspiring. And I think a lot of the pragmatics are really important kind of moving forward. I had two questions. One is, could you tell us a little bit about some of the subspecialty kind of pathway for local Tanzanians in neurosurgery? So one of the barriers that we've seen in neurology is I just came back from working in Malawi, where there's now 2 adult neurologists in the country, and they have some challenges in terms of being recognized as subspecialists because they've received training from outside of the country. And so that's one question. And then I think I also was wondering whether you are working with kind of ministries of health and how you're kind of, I think one of the challenges within the neurosciences is how we kind of make public health realize that this has such a huge impact in terms of population health in the country. And certainly you've shown that from a kind of academic and local standpoint. And it seems like, on a country level, there would be a huge amount of benefit. So is that kind of a component of your work, and have you integrated that?
Yeah, those are great questions. The second question is really important because, and I alluded to that a little bit, no matter how much work we do clinically, if nobody really appreciates it on the government level or the administrative level, then it just basically is like you never did it. And that's a very difficult problem to tackle because as clinicians, there's only limited time that we have to really handle this. We try to kind of have an impact by publishing, simply by putting out publications. Like we published 4 or 5 papers on the mortality of severe traumatic brain injury was like 70% over like 10 years. And we published every year. And somebody sooner or later should really listen to this, right? In the absence of really having contacts, I personally never had the time or the energy to really go beyond my clinical contacts. I would have access to people, but I just never pursued that because I just thought that this is really up to the Tanzanians. I mean, this is their country and their problem. And all I can do is I can teach and train. That's really where I see my role. So I haven't done that, but it is very important. And there are some, Gail Rousseau, for example, she's a neurosurgeon who is very, very involved on the leadership level when it comes to global neurosurgery. And we talked about the G4 Alliance the other day, which is an organization that brings together trauma care, surgery, anesthesia, and others on a political level also, and works very closely with the WHO. And if I had the time to get involved, I would love to do that. I just don't, other than being supportive, I just don't have the time. But people like Gail Rousseau, for example, I would heavily rely on those people then who are maybe more senior and are not as clinically active anymore and have really this passion. So there are connections there. And I'm sure in neurology, there's probably a similar organization that's involved. But I personally, I have not been able to really address this directly, other than by publishing papers and by supporting the people who want to do this type of work. In terms of the neurosurgical training, it's very complicated in Tanzania. I think and the Tanzanians here, they know probably better. The way I understand it, you train in surgery first, and then you go into neurosurgery. I think there's a COSEXA program that's like a more regional amongst other countries where I think you can go into neurosurgery in an earlier stage. I don't understand exactly how you pick and who is being picked for what program, but it is complicated. Yeah. But thanks for your interest. That's great.
Thank you for your question. There are some maybe final questions in the chat that came up, such as if there's any program and training that are open to undergraduate students that you know of, Dr. Härtl.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
If there are any program or training that are open to undergrad students, that is a question by Mulukin Tekle.
Yeah, I mean, we've had undergraduate students join. It's a little bit of a challenge because there's only so much you can do when you're here and really busy with your education. But what we've done is, we have weekly Zoom meetings. We've got Anthony here right now, who's our research student, fellow, and there are certain projects that we're working on. I mean, if somebody is local here, let's say undergraduate, and they have a particular project they're interested in, and then also maybe willing to go on one of those trips to really, or even independently, you can go over there and spend some time there just to get a sense for, is this the type of work that you're interested in? Then I would strongly recommend that. But it really requires, I get a lot of requests from people all over the place, and they want to do like remote research. I don't believe in that. This is unfortunately, you got to be local, you got to show up, and you got to really have a physical kind of presence. And I think it is really important for all of those who have an interest in this work, like Dr. Thakur. I mean, go to Malawi and see first, is this really something you really want to do? Because it's an important decision for your career also, if you want to make this part of your career. I've had a lot of individuals who joined us and then they realized that this is not really what they're interested in.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. I know there's not other questions that seem to be popping in the chat, and in the interest of time, I thank everyone for joining today. And again, coming next, we have Dr. Mangat, an intensive care doctor who has done work in Tanzania through the Neurosurgery Project, who's going to come and join us for the next talk in October. Thank you, Dr. Hartl, again, and have a great day or night or morning, depending where you are in the world, everyone.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Magali, and everyone.
Good. Aha, 10 شبه